The course starts off by looking at some interesting experiments, interesting scientific ideas that led to a lot of the stuff that we take for granted in the modern world. And so, what we'll look at here is three examples, and then we'll move on later on. Now, the first one has to do with peptic ulcers. Now, peptic ulcers in the 21st century aren't a huge issue for most people, but in the 1970s, 60s, and for a lot of time before then, they were a massive problem, particularly for people in the Western world. And they used to be blamed on things like smoking, poor diet, stress, and things like that. Now, they all contribute, but they weren't necessarily the underlying cause. And the treatment for it pretty much was a lifetime supply of very, very strong antacids. Now, a couple of Australian scientists, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, working in Western Australia, were looking at biopsies of peptic ulcer patients, and they made some interesting discoveries. And so, of course, the first thing was, when they were observing their biopsies, they noticed that a good portion of the patients seemed to have this H. pylori in there, this bacterium. And they were looking at it and saying, well, if all these biopsies have it in there, is there a link between the patients with really severe peptic ulcer problems and this H. pylori? Now, of course, that was a little bit of a problem and was really not accepted at the time, because people assumed then that things like bacterium couldn't live in things like the gastric system, particularly in the stomach. The stomach has an exceptionally high pH, very highly acidic, and it was assumed that bacterium couldn't actually live in that environment. And of course, one of the things there, Barry Marshall, at the time, quite young and boisterous, and because they were getting so much frustration and negative response from other scientists, Marshall decided to do an interesting little experiment and did it on himself. He made a broth out of some of the cells that they'd cultured, swallowed it, and within a week was exhibiting all the symptoms of peptic ulcers. And what he did then is he made the assumption that, well, the H. pylori caused this. If I take a course of antibiotics, then I may be able to cure it, which is exactly what he did. And when you look at that there, of course, what we now know is that they eventually did win the Nobel Prize, was eventually accepted. And of course, this acceptance of their results also means that things such as the acceptance of the bacterium causing the problem is just commonplace now. You even go to encyclopedias and textbooks and they'll show you the diagrams of bacterium getting in, destroying the cells and causing problems. Another Australian invention is the cervical cancer vaccine, where it was shown that the majority of cervical cancers were caused by a viral infection. You also have, there's a whole range of studies going into microbes called extremophiles, which are microbes that live in extreme environments, whether it's highly acidic, kilometers deep in rocks, or some microbes hanging around and feeding off nuclear fuel rods, such as in Chernobyl. So another interesting experiment that sort of led to something completely new is that of von Helmont. And von Helmont was looking, or wanted to explore, the idea of how plants grew. And so his idea, his hypothesis was that the plants were eating the soil. So they were taking stuff from the soil and using that to grow. And so he came up with a reasonably simple little experiment where he planted a little sapling of a willow tree and then just watered it for 5 years. And so what had started off as a little sapling over time grew into quite a massive plant. And then he carefully measured the difference there. He took the tree out, carefully removed the soil, and noticed that the soil hadn't changed in mass. The plant, on the other hand, had increased its mass massively. It was so much larger than it was before. And when he compared that, he saw that there was only a little bit of mass lost from the soil, and he assumed that that was maybe lost due to environmental factors, maybe a bit of wind or stuff blowing away, and that the amount of loss from that was insignificant. And so his conclusion was that plants just grew by consuming water. And this was a really interesting experiment for no other, well, lots of reasons, but the main one, it's the first quantitative study on plant biology. Now, of course, he didn't know, or no one knew at the time that there was a process of gaseous exchange going on in the trees. Stomata hadn't been discovered yet on the underside of the leaves. And so it's a good example, though, of showing some of the stepping stones to understanding. You can find out an effect, and even though his conclusions in the end were wrong, they were a stepping stone to understanding plant biology in a lot more detail. Our last example in this little section has to do with the microwave. Now, the microwave oven is something that's ubiquitous in almost every household. It's the sort of kitchen appliance that pretty much is penetrated into every aspect of our lives. Most workplaces will have a microwave there. They probably won't have an oven. So in that way, it's something that people have sort of just accepted has always been part of their lives. Now, the interesting thing about this is the person credited with inventing it there, which is Percy Spencer. This is an example of an idea that's come about because of something completely unrelated. Now, if you want to at one stage have a look at the life of Percy Spencer, really, really interesting. He joined the Navy and had a keen interest in electronics, which was just this burgeoning brand new thing at the time. And by being in the Navy, he had lots of time to read and study, and basically became an expert in electronics. And during the Second World War, became an expert in the new field of radar. And while he was working on these radar installations, he actually noticed something. Because he worked long hours and he sort of worked intermittent times and that, he liked to do things like keep a chocolate bar in his pocket. And while he was working on one of these radar installations, he noticed that the chocolate bar in his pants had melted. And it wasn't just melted because it had been in his pants or whatever. It had liquefied. And he put two and two together and realized that the microwaves had an effect on the food. And by doing this here, he then, because he noticed that this microwave had an effect, he tested it on other foods. The first microwave popcorn was made pretty quickly afterwards. There are stories that they tried to do things like eggs, and the egg, unfortunately, one of the things there, to never microwave eggs unless you've got some special sort of apparatus doing it, because they will explode. And again, in this case here, what we have is a serendipitous idea. So serendipity, essentially, you're saying you've discovered something and it's led to something completely new. It's like an inspirational idea. And of course, 70, 80 odd years later, we now have a brand new way of cooking that's cheap, convenient, uses less energy. Not perfect, but it is what it is. And, from the first microwave oven costing probably about $100,000 in today's money, to something you go down to the cheap retail store and buy for $50. And of course, this one here, the radar range, is one of the early ones. A lot smaller now.